The Gespe'gewa'gi Management Plan is a land use plan that takes what the community members have identified as their vision, what it is that they want to protect, what they want to maintain in terms of the access to the territory, and really their how they want to protect the territory. The reason why it's beneficial for us to have a land management plan is because when consultations arrive in our office, we need a way to sort of vet them through a process that is taking into account all of the development happening on the territory, not only specific one-offs. So this gives us a global approach to the protection of the health of the territory. So we want to make sure that we're protecting rivers and that our animal species are able to move around and to have that sort of freedom, I guess, the same that our people would have that freedom in the territory.
Two-eyed seeing essentially is the idea of taking the best of both worlds, but from Mi'kmaq traditional knowledge and from modern Western science. Essentially, we combine them together to create something that's better than the two separate into one better whole. And then one of the things that exemplifies that is the water first approach. Because according to Mi'kmaq knowledge and traditions and just culture, water is central to everything. And well, the water first approach is the application of that in science. So science basically says, well, a lot of the science says, water is central to all life, so therefore we should take care of water. So it's combining those two together and coming up with a philosophy that we use to guide the Gespe'gewa'gi Management Plan. Priority watersheds are where 80% of Mi'kmaq cultural use happens. These areas are the most important. We marked them out in purple here, or mauve. Mi'kmaq culture takes 80% of Mi'kmaq cultural use happens in these watersheds. As such, we want to make sure that culture has an even bigger component in the decision-making process. So when we're evaluating projects, we make sure that culture is the #1 criteria. So how is this project going to affect culture? How is it going to impact people's ability to practice our culture on the territory? Well, and then we say, well, if it does have an impact on culture, how do we mitigate it? In the rest of the territory, like that's demarked in white, essentially those areas, it's the environment that's #1, and then culture, and then the economics of a project. Here we're trying to switch that dynamic in these priority watersheds. Like we said, 80% of the use happens there. They're very important if we want to be able to pass on the knowledge, and to practice our culture, and to keep it going, we have to have areas where we are able to use it, to feel safe to use it and feel empowered to use it. So these are what we're trying to do with the priority watersheds. A lot of the data that these priority watersheds are based on are from our traditional use study and our use and occupancy studies, and also from a number of consultations that we've been doing over the years. We got a lot of information about where people use the territory, and the primary usage points happened here. One of the things so we were like, how do we make sure that the culture is protected? How do we make sure that people are able to go out? Well, by developing these priority watersheds. We analyzed where the majority of the territory was used, and by like a huge margin, these were the most important areas. They tend to follow along rivers, and which is actually really traditionally accurate, which was fun to see. But so by marking out these watersheds, we were able to figure out how do we make sure that the entire ecosystem that leads to us being able to use our culture, how do we protect it? That's why we did the watershed management units. So these areas are our watersheds. Essentially, they're giant drainage basins where all the water, like there's mountain ranges that forces the water down into a central point, into the, well, in this case, if we're using the Gespe'gewa'gi, goes into the Gespe'gewa'gi and then into the Baie Those areas, those giant water basins are their own little ecosystems. You can say I'm really generalizing and simplifying it, but their own little systems. So if I affect something up here, it has an impact down here. So therefore, if you want to protect what's down here, you have to control what happens up here. That's why when we develop the watershed managements, we want to make sure that we're taking the whole system in place, not just focus pinpoint activities. The Mi'kmaq environmental standards are essentially two types of buffers. We have our cultural buffers and we have our water protection buffers. We'll start. The cultural buffers are essentially around fixed cultural sites. Those are sites that can't really move. Like a moose population can move around, so your kill sites are going to move around too. Where you hunt them are going to move around. Species like plant species will move around, but these are fixed cultural sites. So like cabins tend to stay in one place. Burial sites are very important, have to be protected, and they don't tend to move. So how do we protect these areas? Well, we said, how about a 1.5 kilometer buffer? A buffer essentially is just an area of space where in our GMP, it's essentially a buffer where there's no activity happening. So no logging, no mining. We also don't want people to be building infrastructure there, so roads, houses. Now, there's always flexibility, because if someone wants to build a cabin where there's other cabins and people are okay, sure. But it's meant to try to limit the development as much as possible. These cultural buffers, so we used 1.5 kilometers radius. It creates a good area where people can move around. It was a range that was used in other communities, and we're adapting and we're workshopping with the community, seeing if it's okay. Up to now, we're getting a good response. And then there's the water protection buffers. So those buffers are around lakes, rivers, streams, brooks, any form of water, and also wetlands. Those areas are really important because they have a lot of cultural importance to us, but they're also important for the ecosystem as a whole. Waterways are usually good places for medicinal plants. They're good places for biodiversity. You have your salmon rivers, are very important to Mi'kmaq culture. So we created buffers around them. They vary from the size of the river, but they're multifunctional buffers too. So they help the ecosystem by protecting the river, but they also create a place where species can move. The animals can use as what we call corridors of travel. So with these buffers in place, we're helping create a network where basically there's more green space throughout Gespe'gewa'gi. We wanted to create a good system of resiliency in Gespe'gewa'gi. And there's also the added benefit that protects things that are important to Mi'kmaqs. Water being the most important. Water came out to being as one of the biggest components that are culturally for us, but also important to us as a whole. So therefore, if we protect the water, we're protecting ourselves. The entire notion, we're applying the notion of water first. So therefore, water is the highest standard that we can have in our territory, so that's why we're protecting it. So that's what we're achieving with those water protection buffers. Of course, we're going to be adding more environmental standards as we grow the GMP and grow into different industries and start regulating and just basically keep growing our capacities. So we'll look forward to that in the future.
We have a lot of work to do in terms of bringing it out to communities. So we've started a citizen engagement process around Gespe'gewa'gi Management Plan, where we want to introduce to the communities the results of their work. Really, what it is us taking what we've heard and translating into a land use plan. Now we need to go back out, talk to community members, reaffirm that this is what they're saying, that we've got it right. If there's changes that need to be made, they'll be made. The recommendations will all be considered. We also have to start a discussion around the governance. So how is it that we're going to implement this land use plan? Who's going to monitor it? You know, there's always going to be, we're constantly going to be evolving with it. It's going to be a living document. But we need to give it back to the communities. We need to really put it in their hands to own it. And that's going to be a big part of the work that you're going to see coming out of our office over the next year, because we're at the point where we can say that we are able to start testing it through consultations, but we really need to bring put it back in the hands of the community so that they can really make it theirs.